Wyatt Montgomery thought he had ordered a bride, a woman whose name was written neatly on a contract. But when Abigail Foster stepped off that train wearing another woman's identity, she brought something no paper could promise: a fierce mind, a wounded heart, and the courage to challenge every injustice on his land. What begins as deception soon becomes a test of love, trust, and whether a cowboy can see the woman behind the lie.
The room smelled of damp wood and the iron-gray sky pressing against the window. It was St. Louis, 1878. The kind of cold that didn't just sit on your skin. It crawled inside and made a home in your marrow. I sat at a scarred oak table. On it sat a guttering candle and $3. $3.72 to be exact. It was the price of my life. Or maybe just the price of my funeral. In the corner, the bed was empty. Sarah Jenkins had occupied it 2 days ago. Now she was buried in a pauper's grave. Fever took her quick. It didn't care that she had a contract. It didn't care that she had a train ticket to a place called Rattlesnake Flats. I looked at the mirror. My face was pale, my eyes were tired. I was a teacher without a school, a woman without a name that meant anything to the bank. I reached for the trunk under the bed. Sarah's trunk. Inside, the paper crinkled. A marriage contract, a partnership. Wyatt Montgomery was looking for a wife who could handle a ledger. Sarah was a bookkeeper. I was a teacher. We both knew the weight of a pen. I stood up. My legs were shaky, but my head was clear. I spoke to the empty room. Not because I was crazy, because a truth unsaid is a truth that doesn't exist. Poverty shouldn't strip a person of their soul, I said. My voice was raspy. It shouldn't take away who I am. This society tells me I have 2 choices. I can be a wife, or I can starve. I can belong to a man, or I can belong to the dirt. I gripped the edge of the table. But I have a right to live, I continued. I have a human right to survive, even if I have to borrow a name to do it. Life is a gift. Dignity isn't something you're born with. It's something you fight for when the world tries to take it away. I am taking this ticket. Not to steal, but to save the only thing God gave me that's actually mine. My existence. I blew out the candle. The smoke trailed upward like a ghost. I packed my small bag. I took Sarah's contract. I took her ticket. I left my own name in that cold, damp room. Abigail Foster died in St. Louis that night. Or maybe she was just going into hiding. The walk to the station was long. The mud was thick. The iron horse was waiting, huffing steam into the dark air. It was a monster of coal and fire. It promised a new start, or a spectacular end. I climbed the steps. The conductor looked at me. He saw a woman in a plain wool coat. He saw a traveler. "Ticket, miss?" I handed it over. My fingers didn't tremble. "Sarah Jenkins," I said. The name felt heavy, like a coat that didn't fit. But it was warm, and it was moving west. As the wheels began to churn and the whistle shrieked, I leaned my head against the cold glass. I watched St. Louis disappear into the soot. I had no idea who Wyatt Montgomery was. I didn't know if Texas would swallow me whole. But I was alive, and for now that was the only law that mattered. The train slowed with a screech, metal grinding on metal, a final heavy huff of steam. Rattlesnake Flats. It wasn't much. A few wooden buildings. A station that looked like it might blow over in a stiff breeze. And heat. A dry, baking heat that sucked the moisture right out of your lungs. I stepped down onto the platform. My boots felt heavy. My heart felt heavier. I saw him standing by a hitching post, a tall man, shoulders broad as a barn door, a hat pulled low over eyes that looked like they'd seen too many winters and not enough rain. Wyatt Montgomery. He walked toward me. He didn't smile, he didn't frown, he just looked. In his hand he held a small, grainy photograph, a tintype of the real Sarah Jenkins. He looked at the photo. Then he looked at me. "You're taller than I pictured," he said. His voice was like gravel in a tin cup. "The camera can be a liar," I replied. My voice was steady. That was the teacher in me. Never let the students see you sweat. I am Sarah Jenkins. I assume you are Mr. Montgomery. He nodded once. Short, sharp. I am. This is my mother, Martha. A woman stepped out from behind him. She was small, but she had a spine like a rifle barrel. We had shared a coach for the last 50 miles. She hadn't said a word. She had just watched me. Her eyes were sharp. Too sharp. "Welcome to Texas, Sarah," Martha said. She looked at me for a long beat. She knew. I could see it in the tilt of her head. She had seen me reading. She had seen the way I held myself. She knew I wasn't the woman in that contract. But she didn't say a word to her son. Wyatt grabbed my trunk. He tossed it into the back of a buckboard wagon like it weighed nothing. "Get up," he said. We rode out of town in silence. The sky was a blue so deep it hurt to look at. The land was flat, brown, brutal. "I didn't order an ornament, Sarah," Wyatt said, eyes on the horses. "I requested a partner. This ranch is a hard place. It asks everything of you. It asks for your sweat, your sleep, your peace." I looked at him. "A woman is not a piece of furniture, Wyatt. I understand you ordered a bride like you'd order a new saddle. But you need to hear this. A person has an inherent right to be treated with dignity regardless of a contract. I am here to work. I am here to manage your books. But I am not a servant. Equality isn't something given. It's something that exists between two people who respect the soul in each other." Wyatt pulled the horses to a stop. He turned to look at me. "Truly, look at me." "Dignity," he repeated. He tasted the word. "Most folks out here just worry about water and grass, but you talk about the soul." "Because the soul is where the character lives," I said. "And character is the only thing that keeps a person upright when the world tries to push them into the mud. You want a partner? Then respect my mind. That is the only way this works." Wyatt sat there for a minute. The wind whistled through the scrub brush. "My Uncle Gideon wrote that will," Wyatt said. "He was a strange man. He thought a ranch needed more than muscle. He thought it needed a brain. I guess we'll see if you brought yours." He flicked the reins. The wagon lurched forward. Martha spoke from the back seat. Her voice was quiet, but it carried. "People aren't always who they seem, Wyatt," she said. "But sometimes they are exactly who we need. Every human being deserves a second chance at a life. It's a basic human right to seek a better path when the old one is gone. Remember that." I felt my throat tighten. Martha knew. And for some reason she was protecting the lie. We reached the ranch as the sun was dipping low. It was a sprawling place. Gray wood, dust. But it was solid. "Home," Wyatt said. I looked at the porch. I looked at the vast, empty horizon. "It's big," I whispered. "It's a lot of work," Wyatt corrected. "But it's honest. There's a beauty in honesty, Sarah. It's a value I hold above all else. If a man's word isn't good, he's just a ghost walking around in boots. I expect the truth. Always." I looked down at my hands. The lie felt like lead in my belly. "Truth is a complicated thing, Wyatt," I said. "Sometimes the truth is hidden under layers of survival. But I promise you this. I will be honest with this land. And I will be honest with your work." He nodded. He seemed satisfied. For now. I stepped into the house. It was cold inside. Empty. It smelled of old coffee and wood smoke. It was a house waiting to become a home. "Your room is upstairs," Wyatt said. "Dinner is at 6. We start work at 5. I went upstairs. I sat on the edge of the bed. I looked at the contract in my bag. I wasn't Sarah Jenkins. But as I looked out at the Texas stars, I realized I was becoming something else, something stronger. I was a woman fighting for her right to exist. And in 1878, that was the hardest job in the world. The morning came with a crack of light, 5 o'clock. I was down in the kitchen before the coffee was done. Wyatt was already there. He looked at me. He didn't say good morning. He just pointed to a stack of leather-bound books on a side table. "The ledgers," he said. "They're a mess. My uncle kept them in his head. Then he died. Now the bank is breathing down my neck. I sat down. I opened the first book. Ink was splashed everywhere. Numbers were scratched out. It was a disaster. But my mind didn't see a mess. My mind saw a map. I have a gift. I don't talk about it much. I see a page, and it stays. Every line, every digit. It's like a photograph in the back of my brain. I started to read. By noon, I knew the Montgomery Ranch better than Wyatt did. I knew they were overpaying for feed. I knew the cattle count was off by 20 head. And I knew they were bleeding money in a way that didn't make sense. I walked out to the corral. Wyatt was fixing a fence. "You're losing money to the town," I said. He stopped hammering. He wiped sweat from his brow. "What are you talking about?" "The taxes," I said. "The sheriff, Silas Vance, he's been charging you a protection fee for 2 years. It's listed as a legal tax, but there is no such law in the state of Texas." Wyatt stepped closer. "You sure?" "I am," I said. "I remember the tax codes I read in the St. Louis library. Every citizen has a right to be protected by the law, not exploited by it. When a man in a badge uses his power to steal, he isn't just a thief. He's a traitor to the community. Fairness is a right, Wyatt. It isn't a suggestion. We are going to stop paying him." Wyatt looked toward the horizon, toward town. "Vance is a dangerous man, Sarah. He has a badge, and he has a gun. And I have the truth," I said. "The truth is a shield. It's a slow shield, but it's hard to break." Later that evening, I saw the men. The ranch hands. They were sitting around a fire eating beans and salt pork. They were rough men, hard-handed. One of them was trying to read a crumpled newspaper. He was squinting, frustrated. He finally tossed it into the dirt. "Can't make head nor tail of it," he grumbled. I walked over. I picked up the paper. "I can teach you," I said. The men went quiet. They looked at me like I was a strange bird. "Teach us?" one asked. "We're cowpunchers, ma'am, not scholars." "Education is a human right," I said, my voice carrying over the crackle of the fire. "It isn't just for the rich folks in the cities. If you can't read, you're at the mercy of every man with a contract. If you can't sign your own name, you don't truly own your own life. Knowledge is the only weapon that can't be taken from you. It's a tool for freedom, and every one of you deserves to be free." They looked at each other. They looked at Wyatt, who was standing in the shadows of the porch. "Start tomorrow night," Wyatt said. His voice was thick. "She knows her numbers. Maybe she can teach you yours." I went back to the ledgers. I worked until my eyes burned. I found something else. A name. Elias Jenkins. My heart stopped. Elias, Sarah's brother. The ledger showed a payment to him 6 months ago. A large one. Why would Wyatt's uncle pay Sarah's brother? I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. I realized then that this wasn't just a ranch. It was a web of secrets and debts. Martha came into the room. She was carrying a lamp. She set it down next to me. "You're digging deep, Abigail," she whispered. I froze. I didn't breathe. "You called me Abigail," I said, my voice barely a ghost. "I know," she said. She sat down. "I saw the way you looked at that photo at the station. I saw the way you look at Wyatt. You're a good woman, but you're a liar." "I had no choice," I said. "There is always a choice," Martha said. "But sometimes the choices are all bad. You chose to live. That is a human right. To survive is the first law of nature. I won't tell him. Not yet. He needs you. This ranch needs you." "Why?" I asked. "Because the sheriff is coming for this land," Martha said, "and Wyatt is too honest to see a snake in the grass. He thinks a man with a badge is a man of honor. He needs someone who knows how to fight with a pen." I looked at the books. "I can fight," I said. "Then fight," Martha said. "But remember this. A lie is a debt. Eventually, the bill comes due. And when it does, the truth will be the only currency that matters." She left the room. I sat in the dark. I thought about the men I would teach to read. I thought about the sheriff. I thought about Wyatt's eyes. I was Abigail Foster. I was a teacher. I was a fraud. But I was also the only person who could save the Montgomery Ranch. I picked up the pen. I started to write. I wrote the names. I wrote the numbers. I wrote the truth that was hidden in the lies. I wasn't who they ordered, but I was exactly who they needed. And I was going to make sure that before this was over, everyone in Rattlesnake Flats knew that dignity and justice weren't just words in a book. They were the things worth dying for. The wind was howling that Tuesday. It was a lonely sound, the kind of sound that makes you want to pull the curtains and forget there's a world outside. But on a ranch, the world doesn't let you forget. I was out by the wash house. My hands were red from the lye in the cold water. I didn't mind it. It felt real. Every scrub was a way to wash away the woman I'd left in St. Louis. I was Abigail, but to the world, I was Sarah. And Sarah was a woman I was still learning to inhabit. That's when I heard the low growl. I froze. I didn't turn quick. You never turn quick on an animal that's considering whether to bite you. I looked over my shoulder. There he was, a big, brindled cur. Half wolf by the look of his ears. Duke, Wyatt's shadow. He was standing 10 feet off, teeth showing, eyes like yellow glass. Eyes. In the letters Sarah had written, the letters I'd memorized until they were burned into my retinas, she'd mentioned her fear of dogs. She'd told Wyatt's uncle she was terrified of the canine species. It was a specific detail, a small one, the kind of detail a man might use to see if a woman was telling him the truth. I saw Wyatt then. He was leaning against the barn door, watching. He didn't call the dog off. He just stood there with his arms crossed over his chest. A test. It was as plain as the nose on a face. I looked at Duke. I didn't scream. I didn't run. "You're a hungry soul, aren't you?" I said. My voice was low, like a hum. I reached into my apron pocket. I'd swiped a bit of dried beef from the kitchen earlier. I didn't throw it. I held it in my open palm. I lowered myself down, not a crouch, just a gentle lean. "Every living creature has a right to be understood," I said. I wasn't just talking to the dog. I was talking loud enough for the man by the barn to hear. Animals aren't born mean. They're born protective, or they're born scared. It is a fundamental truth that compassion is the only bridge between two different spirits. If I treat you like a monster, you'll act like one. If I treat you with respect, we might find a way to stand on the same dirt. Duke's ears flicked. The growl stopped. He stepped forward. One paw, then another. He took the beef from my hand. His tongue was rough. His tail gave one slow wag. I stood up. I looked straight at Wyatt. "You expected me to faint," I said. Wyatt walked over. His boots crunched on the gravel. He looked at Duke, then at me. His face was hard to read, like a book with the pages stuck together. "Sarah Jenkins said she couldn't stand to be in the same yard as a hound," Wyatt said. "Sarah Jenkins was a woman who lived in a city," I replied. I didn't blink. And people change. Or maybe, Wyatt, you should realize that a person's identity isn't a fixed point. It's a basic human right to grow, to evolve, to leave behind old fears and find new strengths. You shouldn't judge a person by a description written months ago. You should judge them by the person standing in front of you right now. Wyatt rubbed his jaw. "You talk a lot about rights, Sarah. Most folks out here talk about survival." "Survival without rights is just existing," I said. "And I came here for more than just existing. I came here for a life built on mutual respect. You were testing me. You used that animal to try and catch me in a lie. That isn't how you treat a partner. Every individual has a right to be trusted until they prove otherwise. If we are going to build something here, you have to stop looking for reasons to doubt me." He looked down at Duke. The dog was leaning against my knee now. "I've been lied to before," Wyatt said. His voice was quiet. "It makes a man cautious." "Caution is fine," I said, "but suspicion is a poison. It kills things before they have a chance to grow. I am here. I am working. I am fixing your books. That should be enough for today." I turned back to the wash. My heart was thumping against my ribs like a trapped bird. I'd passed the test, but I'd also raised the stakes. I was Abigail. I wasn't Sarah. And every time I spoke about rights and respect, I was showing him the real me. Later that afternoon, Wyatt called me into the barn. There was a mare in the back stall. She'd cut her leg on some wire. It was a nasty gash. "Hold her head," Wyatt said. I grabbed the halter. I stayed calm. I spoke to the horse the same way I'd spoken to the dog. Wyatt worked with a needle and thread. He was steady, gentle. When he finished, he wiped his hands on a rag. "You didn't flinch," he said. "Why would I?" I asked. "Suffering is a universal language, Wyatt. When a creature is in pain, it doesn't matter what they are. They have a right to be helped. They have a right to have their pain eased. It is our moral obligation as thinking beings to provide care for those who cannot care for themselves. Compassion isn't a weakness, it's the highest form of human strength." Wyatt looked at me. For a second, the hardness in his eyes softened, just a fraction. "My wife, she couldn't stand the sight of blood," he said. "She thought the ranch was ugly. She thought the animals were just meat and bone." "Then she didn't see the truth of them," I said. "Everything that draws breath has value, not just because it's useful, but because it's alive. That is the basis of all justice, Wyatt, recognizing the inherent value of life." He didn't say anything for a long time. He just watched the mare breathe. "You're a strange woman, Sarah Jenkins," he said finally. "I'm just a woman who believes in what's right," I said. I left the barn and walked toward the house. Martha was standing on the porch. She had her arms crossed. She'd seen the whole thing. "You're playing a dangerous game, Abby," she whispered as I passed. "It's not a game, Martha," I said. "It's a revolution, one heart at a time." I went inside and opened the ledger. I had work to do. The numbers were waiting, and so was the sheriff. The dust cloud appeared on the horizon around noon on Friday. It was a small cloud, but it was moving fast. One man, one horse. I was sitting at the kitchen table. The ledgers were spread out before me. I'd spent the last 3 days memorizing the discrepancies. I knew every cent that had been siphoned off. I knew every forged signature. My brain was a filing cabinet of corruption. Wyatt was out front. Duke was at his side. Martha was in the kitchen, her hands busy with dough, but her eyes were on the window. "He's here," she said. Her voice was flat. "Silas Vance." I stood up. I felt a coldness settle in my gut. This was the man who was bleeding this land dry. This was the man who thought a star on his chest gave him the right to be a king. I walked out onto the porch. Wyatt was standing there. He looked solid, like an oak, but I knew he was worried. He believed in the law, and that was his blind spot. Sheriff Silas Vance rode into the yard. He was a thin man, long face, eyes that moved like water. He looked like a man who spent his time counting other people's money. He wore a high-crowned hat and a black duster that was coated in gray Texas dust. "Montgomery," Vance said. He didn't get off his horse. He looked down from the saddle. "Nice day for a ride." "Vance," Wyatt said. "What brings you out this way?" "The usual," Vance replied. He patted a satchel on his saddle. "Tax season. The county needs its due. Especially with the new schoolhouse they're talking about in town. Everyone has to chip in." Wyatt reached for his wallet. It was an instinctive move. A good man trying to be a good citizen. "Wait," I said. My voice cut through the air, clear, sharp. Vance's eyes slid to me. He smiled. It wasn't a nice smile. It was the kind of smile a fox gives a hen. "And who might this be?" Vance asked. "The famous bride from St. Louis?" "I am Sarah Jenkins," I said. I stepped down from the porch. I walked right up to the side of his horse. I didn't look up. I looked him in the eye. "And I've been looking at the books, Sheriff." Vance chuckled. "Books? Most ladies around here worry about cookbooks. You shouldn't trouble your pretty head with numbers." "I find numbers very soothing," I said, "because numbers don't lie, unlike men. Sheriff, I've been studying the tax codes of this county. I've also been looking at the receipts you've given the Montgomery Ranch over the last 2 years. There's an extra 4% added to every bill. You've labeled it protection assessment, but there is no such assessment in the state statutes. The yard went quiet. The only sound was the flick of the horse's tail. It's a local matter, Vance said. His voice had lost its humor. A matter of security. Keeping the peace costs money. Keeping the peace is your job, I said. A job paid for by the General Tax Fund. When you charge an individual extra for the service you are already sworn to provide, that is called extortion. It is a fundamental human right to be free from government overreach and corruption. The law is a shield for the people, not a sword for the man wearing the badge. When you use your position to steal, you are violating the very principles of justice that this country was built upon. Wyatt stepped forward. He looked at me, then at Vance. Is this true, Silas? She's a city girl, Wyatt, Vance said. He leaned over his saddle horn. She doesn't understand how things work out here. Out here, the law is what I say it is. No, I said. I raised my chin. The law belongs to the people. It is a shared agreement. Every citizen has a right to fair and equal treatment. No one is above the law, not even the sheriff. To believe otherwise is to accept tyranny. And we are not subjects, Mr. Vance. We are citizens. We have a right to hold our public servants accountable. I have documented every overpayment, every cent. I have it all memorized. If you take one more penny from this ranch that isn't a legal tax, I will take these records to the circuit judge in Abilene. Vance's face went red, a dark, angry red. He gripped his reins. You're making a mistake, lady, he hissed. Texas is a big place. People get lost in it all the time. Threats are the last refuge of a man who knows he's lost the argument, I replied. You can try to intimidate us, but you cannot intimidate the truth. Fairness is a right that we will not surrender. Not today, not ever. Wyatt moved then. He stepped up beside me. He placed a heavy hand on my shoulder. It felt like a mountain. You heard her, Silas, Wyatt said. His voice was like low thunder. The lady is right. If the tax isn't in the books, it isn't getting paid. Now, unless you have a legal warrant, I think you've got riding to do. Vance looked at Wyatt. He looked at Duke, who was baring his teeth. Finally, he looked at me. There was a pure, cold hatred in his eyes. You won't be so brave when the winter comes, Montgomery, Vance said. He jerked his horse's head around. He spurred the animal hard. He rode out of the yard, leaving a trail of dust that tasted like copper. We stood there for a minute. Silence. Wyatt let out a long breath. He looked down at me. You just made an enemy of the most powerful man in the county, he said. He was already your enemy, I replied. He was just a quiet one. Now he's a loud one. But at least we aren't paying for our own destruction anymore. Wyatt, you have to understand something. It is a basic human right to defend your property and your labor from thieves, no matter what they're wearing. If you let a man steal from you once, you've given him permission to steal from you forever. We had to stand up, because if we don't stand for justice in the small things, we'll never find it in the big ones. Wyatt looked toward the horizon. I never thought about it like that. I just thought he was the sheriff. I thought I had to follow the rules. Rules aren't the same as justice, I said. Rules can be twisted. Justice is a constant. It is the right of every man to be treated fairly and to keep what he has earned. Never apologize for demanding what is right. Martha came out onto the porch. She was wiping her hands on her apron. He'll be back, she said. Let him come, I said. Wyatt looked at me then, a long, searching look. You're a firebrand, Sarah, he said. I'm a woman who knows her worth, I replied, and I know yours. That night, the ranch felt different. There was a tension in the air, like the moment before a storm breaks. I sat at the table. I looked at the ledgers. I had saved Wyatt money, but I had put a target on our backs. I thought about the night school. I thought about the men. I thought about the words I'd spoken to Vance. I was Abigail, a teacher, a fraud. But as I watched Wyatt clean his rifle in the corner of the room, I knew one thing for certain. The truth was coming. And when it arrived, it wouldn't care about names. It would only care about who was left standing. I reached for the inkwell. I had more numbers to check, because in this world, knowledge wasn't just power. It was the only way to stay alive. The night school started in the barn. It was a humble beginning. We had 3 lanterns, a crate of charcoal pieces, and the back of some old barn doors to serve as our slate. 5 men sat on hay bales. They looked at me with a mix of fear and hope. They were men who could wrestle a steer to the ground, but they were terrified of a pencil. I stood at the front. Wyatt stood at the back. He was a shadow against the wood, just watching. A man who cannot read his own contract is a man who is partially enslaved, I said. The charcoal felt heavy in my hand. I wrote the letter A on the wood. It was large, bold. I want you to listen to me, I said, looking at each of them. Education is a fundamental human right. It is not a luxury. It is the bedrock of a free society. When a person is denied the ability to learn, they are being denied their full humanity. To be able to read is to be able to think for yourself. It is the right to participate in the conversation of the world. Without it, you are just a tool in another man's hand. You have a right to your own mind. And tonight, we begin to claim it. I saw Wyatt's head tilt. He was absorbing the words. He wasn't just hearing a teacher. He was hearing a philosophy of life. We worked for 2 hours. We did letters. We did basic sums. The men were slow, but they were determined. There is a specific kind of dignity that comes with a grown man learning something new. It's a vulnerable thing, and vulnerability is a sign of a strong heart. When the men filed out, whispering their new sounds to the stars, Wyatt stayed. He walked to the front of the barn. He looked at the charcoal letters on the door. "You speak like a preacher, Sarah," he said. "I speak like someone who has seen what happens when people are kept in the dark," I replied. I started to wipe the charcoal away with a rag. "Knowledge is the light, Wyatt. It's hard to stay a victim when you know how the world works." We walked back to the house together. The air was cool. The smell of sage was thick. My wife, she didn't care for the men, Wyatt said. He was looking at his boots. She thought they were just the help. She didn't think they had anything worth teaching. Then she was wrong, I said. Every human being has an equal right to respect and opportunity. Class and wealth are just accidents of birth. They don't define the quality of a person's soul. A ranch hand has the same right to a bright mind as a governor does. To think otherwise is to accept a lie that keeps the world small and mean. Wyatt stopped. He turned to me. "You're a good woman," he said. "I mean, you're a real woman, not a set of manners in a dress." "I'm just me, Wyatt," I said. My heart was thumping. I wanted to tell him then. I wanted to say, "My name is Abigail, and I am a fraud who loves the way you look at the stars," but I didn't. The lie was a wall, and I didn't know how to climb it without falling. "I appreciate you standing up to Vance," Wyatt said. "Most folks would have stayed quiet. They would have thought it was safer." "Silence in the face of injustice is an act of complicity," I said. "We have a moral obligation to speak the truth, even when our voices shake. It is a human right to live in a world where the law is applied fairly to everyone. When we stay silent about corruption, we are giving up our right to a just society." I didn't do it to be brave. I did it because it was the only thing an honest person could do. Wyatt nodded. He reached out. For a second, I thought he was going to touch my cheek. I wanted him to. I wanted to feel the rough calluses of his hand. But he pulled back. He wasn't ready. And I wasn't real. "Good night, Sarah," he said. "Good night, Wyatt," I whispered. I went up to my room. I sat in the dark for a long time. I realized then that the most dangerous thing on this ranch wasn't the sheriff. It wasn't the cattle. It was the feeling I was starting to have for a man who didn't even know my name. The climax came on a Wednesday. The heat was heavy, the kind that makes the horizon shimmer like a bad dream. A carriage pulled into the yard. It wasn't the sheriff. It was a man in a black suit. Mr. Aldridge from the bank in Abilene. He carried a leather satchel that looked like it held the weight of the world. Wyatt called me into the office. The air in the room was stale. "Mr. Montgomery," Aldridge said, his voice as dry as parchment, "we have a problem with the 1881 mortgage. There is a missing payment of $340. If we don't have proof of payment within 48 hours, the bank will begin the process of seizing the eastern pasture." Wyatt went pale. "My uncle paid that. I remember him saying so. He went into town specifically for it." "Memory isn't a legal document, Wyatt," Aldridge said. I looked at the banker. Then I looked at the satchel. I felt my brain begin to click. I had spent weeks with those books. I knew every smudge. "May I see your ledger, Mr. Aldridge?" I asked. He looked at me with a patronizing tilt of his head. "This is bank business, ma'am. And this is my home," I said. My voice was iron. "I have a right to defend my family's interests. Transparency is a requirement of any fair contract. Every individual has a right to verify the information that is being used to take their property. To withhold the books is to act with bad faith. If the bank is honest, it has nothing to fear from a woman's eyes." Aldridge hesitated. Then he slid the book across the desk. I didn't flip the pages, I didn't hunt. I saw the numbers and I let my brain take the picture. "Contract number 1847-C, I said. Signed September 14, 1881. The payment of $340 was made on March 3, 1883. It was paid via check number 0092 from the First Bank of Abilene." Aldridge blinked. He looked at his book. He turned to the March 1883 entries. His finger stopped. How did you know that?" he asked. "I haven't even turned to that page yet." "I read the ranch's internal ledger 2 weeks ago," I said. "I remember everything I read. The human mind is a powerful tool, Mr. Aldridge, and truth has a specific weight. That payment was made. If your records don't show it, then someone in your bank has committed a clerical error. Or perhaps someone has tampered with the books. Every citizen has a right to accurate record-keeping. It is a basic form of justice. You cannot take a man's land based on a mistake." Aldridge looked at the numbers. He looked at me. He looked at Wyatt. I will have to verify this," he stammered. "If check 0092 exists in our archives, then the matter is settled." He packed his bag and practically ran out of the house. Wyatt stood there. He was looking at me like I was a ghost. "How did you do that?" he asked. "Sarah, that payment wasn't in the books I gave you. I kept that separate ledger in the bottom of the trunk. I haven't even shown you that trunk yet." The room went cold. The clock on the wall seemed to tick louder. I found it while I was cleaning," I lied. But the lie sounded hollow, like a bell with a crack in it. Wyatt didn't move. He reached into his vest pocket. He pulled out a small, crumpled piece of paper. A tintype photograph. The one from the station. The one of the real Sarah Jenkins. "I got this in the mail today," Wyatt said. His voice was low, dangerous. "I wrote to the agency in St. Louis. I asked for a clearer copy. I told them I wanted to frame it for my wife." He laid the photo on the desk. The woman in the photo was short. She had a round face, she had dark hair. I was tall, I had a sharp jaw, I had light hair. "You're not Sarah Jenkins," Wyatt said. It wasn't a question. I felt the floor tilt. I gripped the edge of the desk. "No," I said. "I'm not." "Then who are you?" he asked. The pain in his voice was worse than anger. It was the sound of a man being broken for the second time. "Who are you to come into my house, sleep in my beds, and teach my men about justice? Who are you to lecture a sheriff about honesty while you're wearing a dead woman's name?" I looked him in the eye. I didn't look away. "My name is Abigail Foster," I said. I was a teacher. Sarah Jenkins was my friend. She died in my arms in a room that cost $6 a week. She died because she had no money and no hope. I took her ticket because I had no other way to stay alive. I am a woman who was pushed to the edge by a world that doesn't care about poor women. I am a human being who claimed her right to survive. Wyatt slammed his hand on the desk. You lied. You played me for a fool. I lied about my name, I shouted back. But I never lied about the work. I never lied about the numbers. And I never lied about the rights of the people on this ranch. Wyatt, listen to me. A person's worth is not found in their name. It is found in their deeds. It is a fundamental human right to have a second chance at life. When society fails to provide a path for the honest poor, people will find their own way. To judge me solely for my deception without looking at my contribution is to ignore the complexity of human survival. I saved your land today. I taught your men to read. Are those things lies, too? They're built on a lie, Wyatt said. How can I believe anything you say now? Believe your eyes, I said. Believe the books. Wyatt, you have a right to the truth, and I'm giving it to you now. I didn't do this to hurt you. I did it because I wanted to live. Is that a crime? To want to breathe? To want to have a home? To want to belong somewhere? Every human soul has a right to seek a place where they are valued. I found that here, and I worked for it. I earned every meal I ate on this ranch. Wyatt turned his back to me. He stood by the window looking out at the land. The train leaves Friday morning, he said. His voice was dead. Be on it. Wyatt, get out, he said. I walked out of the room. I felt like I was walking through water. I went to my room. I didn't cry. I sat on the edge of the bed. I had told the truth, and the truth had done exactly what I feared. It had set me free, free to go back to being nobody, free to go back to the cold and the hunger. But as I looked at my hands, I realized they were still steady. I had spoken up for justice. I had spoken up for rights. I had lived as Abigail for a few weeks, and even if I had to leave, I knew one thing. I wasn't who he ordered. But for a little while, I was exactly who I was meant to be. And that was a truth that even Wyatt Montgomery couldn't take away. The sun didn't care about my heartbreak. It rose anyway. It spilled gold over the Texas scrub, lighting up the dust like it was something precious. I sat on my trunk in the hallway. I was dressed in the same plain wool coat I'd worn when I arrived. My hands were folded in my lap. I was waiting. Friday had arrived. The day of the train. Wyatt came out of his room. He didn't look at me. He picked up my trunk. He walked past me, his boots heavy on the floorboards. I followed him down the stairs. Martha was in the kitchen. She wasn't cooking. She was just standing there holding a cold cup of coffee. Her eyes were red. Abigail, she said. She didn't call me Sarah. I stopped at the kitchen door. I looked at her. Thank you, Martha, for the kindness, for the silence. Every human soul has a right to be seen for who they are, not just what they've done to stay alive, Martha said. Her voice was steady but thin. Compassion isn't a gift you give to the perfect. It's a right we owe to the struggling. I saw a teacher who cared. I saw a woman who stood up when the men stayed seated. That is the truth of you. The rest is just the noise of a hard world. I nodded. I couldn't speak. I walked out to the wagon. The ride to town was silent. Wyatt drove the team like he was trying to outrun a storm. He kept his eyes on the road. I kept mine on the land. I looked at the fences. I looked at the cattle. I looked at the schoolhouse we'd started to talk about. It was a beautiful land, but it wasn't mine. We pulled into Rattlesnake Flats. The town was already awake, and they were watching. Word travels fast in a place with only one street. They knew the mail-order bride was leaving. They knew there was a scandal. They stood on the boardwalks. They whispered behind their hands. Wyatt pulled the wagon up to the station. He jumped down. He set my trunk on the platform. The whistle blew in the distance. A long, lonely wail. The iron horse was coming to take me back to nowhere. Wyatt stood by the wagon wheel. He looked at me then, truly looked at me. You should have told me, he said. I should have, I agreed. But I didn't believe a man like you existed. I didn't believe a person could be judged by their work instead of their name. In the city, Wyatt, a woman is just a line in a ledger. To be poor is treated like a crime. But survival is a fundamental human right. We are born with the right to breathe, to eat, and to find a place under the sun. When the system fails to give us a path, we have to cut our own. I cut mine. I don't apologize for living. The train pulled in. It was a monster of steam and soot. It hissed at the platform, impatient to be gone. "Boarding for St. Louis!" the conductor shouted. I walked to my trunk. I reached for the handle. But a hand got there first, a large, calloused hand. Wyatt gripped the trunk. He didn't lift it toward the train. He lifted it back toward the wagon. The town went quiet. The sheriff, Silas Vance, was standing by the saloon door. He straightened up. He looked confused. "Wyatt?" I whispered. "The train is leaving," Wyatt said. He looked at the conductor. He looked at the townspeople. Then he looked at the sheriff. "Is she getting on?" the conductor asked. "No," Wyatt said. His voice was like a bell, clear, loud. "She isn't." The train hissed one last time. The wheels began to turn. The cars slid past us, one by one. The red caboose disappeared around the bend. The train left. And I was still standing on the platform. The town was shocked. You could hear the collective gasp over the wind. The next move wasn't a departure. It was a stand. Wyatt walked right up to me. He ignored the stares. "I'm not who you ordered," I said. My voice was trembling. "No," Wyatt said. "You're better." "I ordered a name on a contract. I got a partner who knows that justice is more than a law on a page. I got a woman who knows that equality means standing side by side in the dirt. Dignity isn't something you buy with a ticket, Abigail. It's something you build with your hands. You built something here. I'm not letting it go." He turned to the crowd. He looked straight at Silas Vance. "She stays," Wyatt shouted, "and she stays as my partner. If any man has a problem with her past, he can bring it to me, because on this ranch we don't define a person by where they started. We define them by where they're going." He tossed my trunk back into the wagon. He held out his hand to me. "Get up," he said. I took his hand. I climbed up. As we drove out of town, I looked back. Silas Vance was standing in the middle of the street. He looked like a man who had just realized the ground was shifting under his feet. "Why?" I asked as we hit the open road. "Because you were right," Wyatt said. He didn't look away from the horses. "A person has a right to a second chance. It's a basic part of being human to be allowed to start over. If I sent you back, I'd be just as bad as the people who pushed you out in the first place. I don't want a Sarah Jenkins. I want the woman who stood up to a sheriff for me." I leaned back against the seat. I watched the Texas sky. I had lost my name. But for the first time in my life, I had found my place. The peace didn't last long. It never does when there's money and land on the line. 2 days later, a carriage arrived. It wasn't just the sheriff this time. Beside him sat a man in a dusty city suit. He looked like a vulture in a vest. Wyatt and I were in the yard. We were discussing the new irrigation plan. We stood our ground as the carriage stopped. "Wyatt Montgomery!" Silas Vance shouted. He hopped down, his spurs jingling with a malicious rhythm. "I believe you know Mr. Elias Jenkins." The man in the suit stepped out. He had a mean mouth and eyes that didn't stay still. He looked at me. He sneered. "That's not my sister," Elias said. "My sister Sarah was a quiet girl. This woman is a thief. She's a squatter. She's stolen my sister's life, and she's trying to steal my family's claim to this land." Wyatt stepped in front of me. "She hasn't stolen a thing, Elias. She's worked this land. She's saved it from the bank, which is more than you've ever done." "It doesn't matter," Silas Vance barked. He pulled a heavy stack of papers from his coat. "The DUCL specifically names Sarah Jenkins as the heir to 40% of this property upon marriage to Wyatt Montgomery. Since this woman is a fraud, the marriage is void. The contract is broken. And since there is no legal heir present who meets the criteria, the land reverts to the state for public auction." "I am the heir," Elias shouted. "I'm the next of kin." "You're a parasite," I said. I stepped out from behind Wyatt. I looked at Silas Vance. I looked at the badge on his chest. "Justice is not a game of names, Sheriff," I said. My voice was cold. It was the voice of a teacher who had seen too many bullies in the schoolyard. The law is a servant of the people. It is not a whip for the powerful to use against the weak. You are trying to use a technicality to commit a robbery. Every human being has a right to the fruits of their labor. I have labored here. I have protected this property. To prioritize a name on a piece of paper over the reality of the work done is a violation of the spirit of the law. The law is the law, lady, Vance sneered. No, I said. The law is a tool for fairness. When it ceases to be fair, it ceases to be the law. It becomes tyranny. Every citizen has a right to expect that the legal system will protect the intentions of the dead, not the greed of the living. Wyatt's Uncle Gideon didn't want this land auctioned. He wanted it protected. Martha came out of the house then. She wasn't carrying a weapon. She was carrying a small cedar box. She walked down the steps with a slow, deliberate grace. "Silas," she said, "you always were a man who looked at the clouds and missed the rain." She opened the box. She pulled out a single sheet of paper. It was yellowed. The ink was faded. "My brother Gideon knew Wyatt," Martha said. She looked at her son. He knew Wyatt was a man of the earth, but he lacked the words to defend it. He knew Wyatt needed a partner who could see the snakes before they bit. He didn't write that will because he cared about a girl named Sarah. He wrote it as a test. She handed the paper to Wyatt. "Read it, son," she said. "Read it out loud so the whole county can hear." Wyatt took the paper. He cleared his throat. "To whoever finds this after I'm gone," Wyatt read. "I've spent 50 years on this dirt. I've seen men buy wives like they buy cattle. It's a disgrace to the soul. A woman is not a commodity. She is an equal partner in the eyes of God and should be in the eyes of the law. I put the name C. Jenkins in my will because that was the name on the ledger at the time. But hear this. The land doesn't belong to a name. It belongs to the one who is brave enough to show up when the train stops. It belongs to the one who has the mind to see the truth and the heart to stay when things get hard. If a woman comes here under a different name but with the right spirit, she is the true heir. Character is the only inheritance that matters. Signed, Gideon Montgomery." The yard went silent. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. "That's not legal," Elias Jenkins shrieked. "That's just a letter." "It's a codicil," I said. I stepped forward. I took the paper from Wyatt. I looked Silas Vance in the eye. It was witnessed and notarized by the circuit judge in Abilene 3 days before Gideon died. I remember the stamp. I remember the date. I saw it mentioned in the back of the old ledger, but I didn't know what it was until this moment. Every person has a right to have their final wishes honored. This is the true will of Gideon Montgomery. He wanted a partner for his nephew. He wanted a brain for this ranch. He didn't care about the labels society puts on us. He cared about the truth of the person. I held the paper up. Equality is recognizing that the right person for a job is the one with the skill and the heart to do it, I said. Gideon understood that. He understood that a woman's value isn't tied to her birth certificate or her marriage contract. It's tied to her contribution. I have contributed. I have defended. And according to this document, I am exactly who was ordered. Silas Vance looked at the paper. He looked at the notarized seal. He knew he was beat. He could try to fight it in court, but with a notarized codicil and the town watching, he'd lose. He'd lose his badge. He'd lose everything. "This isn't over," Vance muttered, but his voice lacked the sting it had before. "It is over, Silas," Wyatt said. He stepped up beside me. He put his arm around my waist. "Get off my land, both of you." Elias Jenkins scrambled back into the carriage. Silas Vance followed, his face a mask of bitter defeat. They drove away, the dust settling behind them like the end of a bad dream. We stood there in the yard, Wyatt, Martha, and me. "You knew," Wyatt said, looking at his mother. "Gideon told me," Martha said. She smiled. It was a beautiful, weary smile. "He said, Martha, Wyatt is going to find a woman who is smarter than him. Tell him not to be afraid of it. Tell him to cherish it." I was just waiting to see if you were smart enough to see her, too. Wyatt looked at me. He took my hand. His grip was warm, steady. I see her, he said. Abigail, I reminded him. Abigail, he repeated. It's a good name, I said. It means a father's joy. But for me, it just means free. You are free, Abigail, Wyatt said. Free to stay, free to teach, free to be exactly who you are. Because every human being has that right, I said. The right to be known. The right to be loved for the truth, not the lie. We walked back toward the house. The schoolhouse plans were still on the table. The ledgers were still open. But the numbers didn't feel like a weight anymore. They felt like a foundation. The town of Rattlesnake Flats had expected a scandal. They had expected a woman to disappear on a train. Instead, they got a lesson. A lesson in justice, in character, and in the move a cowboy makes when he realizes that the woman he ordered wasn't half as good as the woman who actually arrived. We went inside. We closed the door. And for the first time in 1878, I didn't feel like I was hiding. I was home. The spring of 1878 didn't just arrive. It exploded. One day the world was gray and brittle, and the next, the Texas prairie was a riot of bluebonnets and Indian paintbrush. The air smelled of damp earth and new life. It was a smell that promised you could wash away just about anything if you were willing to stand in the rain long enough. I stood on the porch of the Montgomery Ranch. I wasn't wearing Sarah Jenkins' wool coat anymore. I was wearing a simple cotton dress, blue as the morning. My sleeves were rolled up. My hands were stained with ink and dirt. Wyatt was out by the gate. He was leaning against a post, watching the sun climb. He looked different. The tightness in his shoulders, that heavy weight of a man waiting for the other shoe to drop. It was gone. He looked like a man who finally knew where his borders were. I walked down the steps. My boots didn't feel heavy today. They felt like they belonged to the person wearing them. "You're up early," Wyatt said. He didn't turn around, but I saw the corner of his mouth twitch. "I have a school to open," I said, "and a ledger to finish. A person's work is never really done, Wyatt. Not if they want to live a life that means something." He turned then. He looked at me. Not as a contract. Not as a solution to a legal problem. He looked at me as Abigail. "You know," Wyatt said, his voice low and rhythmic like the wind in the grass. "I spent a long time thinking a man could order a life. Like a catalog. You pick the parts, you pay the price. You expect it to fit. But a human being isn't a pre-made thing. You can't order a soul, Abigail. You can only meet one. And if you're lucky, you're smart enough to recognize it when it shows up." I stepped up beside him. I looked out at the horizon. "Every human soul has a right to be seen as an individual," I said. I wanted the words to hang in the air. "Not as a category. Not as wife or teacher or immigrant. We have a fundamental right to self-definition. When society tries to box us in, when it tells us we are only worth the name on our birth certificate, it is committing a theft of the spirit. I had to steal a name to find my freedom. But the real crime wasn't my lie. The real crime was a world that didn't give a woman like me a path to walk as herself. We must respect the right of every person to reinvent themselves when the world breaks them. That is how we survive." Wyatt nodded. He reached out. He took my hand. His skin was rough, but his touch was light. "I learned that," he said, "watching you. I learned that equality isn't just a word in a book, it's a practice. It's recognizing that your mind is just as sharp as mine, maybe sharper. It's realizing that a partner isn't someone who follows you. It's someone who stands beside you and sees the things you're too blind to notice. Every man and woman has an equal right to exercise their intellect. To deny that is to weaken the whole community." Later that morning, we rode into Rattlesnake Flats. But we didn't stop at the station. We stopped at the old general store. The town had changed. Or maybe I had. People didn't whisper when I walked by anymore. They didn't look for the fraud. They looked for the woman who had stood up to Silas Vance. They saw the teacher. We walked to the edge of town. There, standing tall and smelling of fresh-cut cedar, was the schoolhouse. It wasn't large, but it had big windows, windows that let the light in. The ranch hands were there, Slim, Cookie, and the others. They were wearing their Sunday best. They looked uncomfortable in their stiff collars, but they were grinning. They had built this, not just with wood and nails, but with the hope that their children and they themselves wouldn't be trapped in the dark anymore. I stood on the steps. I looked at the small crowd. Martha was there, sitting in the front row. Silas Vance was nowhere to be seen. He had retired a week ago. The truth had made his badge too heavy to wear. "Today we open more than a building," I said. My voice was steady. It was the voice I had used in St. Louis, but it was deeper now. It was anchored in the soil. We are opening a door, and I want every one of you to hear this truth. Education is not a privilege for the few. It is a universal human right. When we keep a person in ignorance, we are stripping them of their ability to defend their own interests. We are making them easy to cheat and easy to lead, to read, to write, and to reason. These are the tools of a free people. Every child in this county, regardless of their father's bank account, has a right to a mind that is wide awake. I saw a few of the town elders shift in their seats. They weren't used to hearing a woman talk about rights. But they didn't look away. "And it's not just for the children," I continued. I looked at the ranch hands. "A man is never too old to claim his right to learn. It is a basic human dignity to be able to understand the world around you. We are building a community based on the equality of knowledge. Because when everyone can read the contract, no one can be cheated by the man holding the pen. That is what justice looks like in practice." I took a pair of shears and cut the ribbon. It was a simple act, but it felt like a mountain moving. The afternoon was a blur of laughter and handshakes. I taught the first lesson. A simple one. The word freedom. I showed them how the letters moved, how they stood together. As the sun began to set, casting long purple shadows over the town, Wyatt and I walked back to the wagon. "Abigail Montgomery," he said, testing the name. I stopped. I looked at him. "I haven't said yes to that name yet, Wyatt," I said. A small smile played on my lips. "I like my own name, Abigail Foster. I fought hard to get it back." Wyatt laughed, a real deep sound. "You're right, you did. And you have a right to keep it. A woman's identity shouldn't vanish the moment she says, 'I do.' That's another one of those old rules that doesn't fit the truth of things, isn't it? A marriage should be a union of two whole people, not the vanishing of one into the other." "Exactly," I said. "A true partnership is built on mutual respect for each other's autonomy. I want to be your wife, Wyatt. But I will always be Abigail, and I will always be a teacher. We have to build our life on the right of each person to remain themselves, even while they belong to another." He leaned down. He kissed me. It tasted like spring. It tasted like a promise kept. "I wouldn't have it any other way," he whispered. We drove back to the ranch under a sky filled with more stars than I ever knew existed. The night wasn't scary anymore. It was just an open space, a space for a future. I thought about Sarah Jenkins. I thought about the cold room in St. Louis. I thought about the train ride that felt like an ending. I had been wrong. It wasn't an ending. It was a beginning. I had come to Texas looking for a way to stay alive. I had found something much bigger. I had found the courage to speak the truth. I had found a man who was strong enough to hear it, and I had helped a town realize that justice and dignity aren't just things you hope for. They are things you demand. They are things you build. One letter, one number, and one honest word at a time. I wasn't who he ordered. I was Abigail Foster. And for the first time in my life, that was enough. The wagon turned into the Montgomery gate. The house was waiting. The lamp was in the window. Martha was there. The dog was there. I breathed in the cool night air. It was a good air. It was a free air. And as we pulled up to the porch, I realized the most important lesson of all, the one I would teach every day for the rest of my life. The truth might be hard. It might be dangerous. It might cost you everything you thought you wanted. But the truth is the only ground where you can actually stand. And once you're standing there, truly standing on your own 2 feet with your own name and your own mind, there isn't a train in the world that can take you away from yourself. I stepped down from the wagon. I walked into the house. I was home, and I was exactly who I was meant to be. This channel is dedicated to Western cowboy stories, frontier love, motherly devotion, human kindness, mercy, and the emotional struggles that shape the soul. Please support the channel by liking, commenting, sharing, and subscribing for more inspiring stories. The story you are about to read is entirely fictional. While it may draw inspiration from universal human experiences, it does not depict real people or actual events. Any perceived parallels are coincidental and should not be interpreted as deliberate representations.
In the end, Abigail Foster's story is not simply about a woman who borrowed another name to survive. It is about the long and painful road a human heart must walk before it can stand openly in the truth. She came to Texas carrying a lie, but that lie was born from hunger, fear, poverty, and a world that had given poor women almost no choices. Yet what she built with her own hands was real. The books she balanced were real. The men she taught to read were real. The justice she fought for was real. And the love she found with Wyatt Montgomery became real. Because, in the end, it was strong enough to face the truth. This story teaches us that a person's value should never be measured only by where they came from, the mistakes they made in desperation, or the name written on a piece of paper. True worth is revealed through courage, compassion, honesty, and the good we bring into the lives of others. Abigail reminds us that dignity is not something granted by wealth, status, or society. Dignity is something every soul is born with, and sometimes it must be defended with everything we have. Wyatt's journey is just as important. He begins as a man who believes in contracts, rules, and appearances. But through Abigail, he learns that justice is deeper than the letter of the law, and love is more than possession. A true partner is not someone ordered, owned, or controlled. A true partner stands beside you, challenges your blindness, strengthens your spirit, and helps you become better than you were before. His decision to let the train leave without Abigail shows us the power of forgiveness. Not the kind that ignores wrongdoing, but the kind that sees the whole person behind the mistake. The story also reminds us of the power of education. When Abigail teaches the ranch hands to read, she gives them more than letters and numbers. She gives them freedom. She shows that knowledge is a shield against exploitation, a light against fear, and a tool that helps ordinary people protect their own lives. In a hard world where many are silenced, cheated, or dismissed, learning becomes an act of dignity. Most of all, this story leaves us with one powerful message. The truth may hurt, and it may cost us dearly, but it is the only solid ground on which a meaningful life can be built. Lies may help us escape for a moment, but only truth allows us to finally come home to ourselves. Abigail did not find freedom by becoming Sarah Jenkins. She found freedom when she had the courage to stand as Abigail Foster, with her own name, her own mind, and her own worth. So may this story remind us to look at people with mercy before judgment, to honor character above reputation, to defend the weak against corruption, and to believe that even broken lives can be rebuilt on honest ground. Because sometimes the person who arrives carrying the heaviest secret may be the very one who brings light, justice, and healing to everyone around them.